Greetings, gentle viewers. This is George from Ireland. I am continuing my series about international relations from 1919 to 39 for History GCSE. We're now looking at isolationist countries. Well, what is an isolationist country? That would be a country which, whilst trading with other countries, chooses not to be involved in alliances, not to intervene in other parts of the world. You might think that's a laudable thing. Perhaps we could do with a bit more isolationism back now. Anyway, bit more isolationism now, like there used to be back then. Other people say, no, one should intervene. Depends on the situation. But I don't wish to go off on that tangent. Anyway, France and the United Kingdom were mighty countries back then. They're not anymore. They were hit hard by the Great Depression, and they became preoccupied by their domestic discontents, rising unemployment, and great hardship even for those who had jobs. The United States had been isolationist from more or less straight after the First World War. So in almost every country around the world, fewer people were working and spending. Governments therefore had less revenue. There was less income to tax, and there were less sales to tax, less imports and exports to tax. They cut military spending. France and the United Kingdom spent as little as possible on modern equipment. So defence was a case of not just cutting fat, they cut into muscle as well. They bought as little fuel as they could for their militaries. Ships seldom put to sea to practice sailing. Pilots seldom got to fly, and tank crews had little opportunity to practice driving their tanks. As little ammunition was purchased as possible, so they couldn't practice marksmanship. In 1931, there was a mutiny in the Royal Navy at Invergordon. That's a naval base in Scotland over proposed pay cuts. Not a single person was killed, and the ratings were persuaded to sail back and surrender in return for no action being taken against them, though that wasn't honoured. Some of them were sent to jail for a few years. Some of them were dismissed. Anyway, France and the United Kingdom had become very reluctant to fight, and they felt they didn't have the capability. They adopted a policy of appeasement. The idea was, if you give these aggressors what they want, they will calm down, they'll be satisfied, and the problem will go away. It sometimes works. Winston Churchill, the British statesman, remarked it's like feeding a crocodile in the hope that it will eat you last. So if the aggressors got what they wanted, they would demand more and more, and they could see they could get it without having to fight. When they did have to fight, they'd become very strong because they'd absorb more territory, more factories, therefore more military manufacturing capacity. And the demands of the aggressors would not be reasonably limited. It would only whet their appetite for fresh conquests. The Anglo-German Naval Agreement of 1935 is an example of appeasement. The United Kingdom consented to Germany breaking the Treaty of Versailles. The German Navy would be allowed a navy 35% of the size of the Royal Navy. This was calculated in terms of tonnage of displacement. How many tons of water does a warship displace? That's how they measured, not the length of the warships. The French government was irate that their British confrères had agreed to this without even consulting them. The German government soon began subtly cheating on this deal. In reality, their navy became more than 35% of the size of the Royal Navy. The British government believed that if they let the Germans have some of what they want, the Germans would be grateful, and as they appreciated this, they would be reasonable, and tranquility would be restored. The Germans wouldn't demand more, they would be satiated. Some German claims appear to be fair. Another point is the German Navy was rather stronger than that 35% figure suggested, because by 1939, almost all the German ships were very new, and a lot of the Royal Naval ships were quite aged. More of this spread across the globe. Germany had no overseas colonies, so almost all her fleet was concentrated in the North Sea. There are other examples of appeasement, such as the Naval Pact and the Munich Agreement of 1938. So I'll come on to them. Well, look at the Munich Agreement of September 1938. Adolf Hitler demanded the cession of the Sudetenland, which belonged to Czechoslovakia. Czechoslovakia was a country that was created for the very first time in 1918. For centuries prior to that, it belonged to the Austrian Empire. The Sudetenland is a semicircle of land in the west of Czechoslovakia. This area was peopled by 3 million ethnic Germans and several 100,000 Czechs. The Sudetenland has a chain of mountains that form a natural frontier between it and Germany. In view of the ethnicity of this region, there was a strong case for the area being handed over to Germany. The Germans formed a high majority of the people there, particularly the bourgeoisie, as it happens. There were working class Germans too, as there are a few middle class Czechs. So there was the Sudeten-German Party. The other various German parties in the Sudetenland united to form a single party. Some were Nazis, many were not, but almost universally they voted to join Germany. The Sudetenland was effectively independent in the early 1920s and called itself the Austro-German state. It was then made to be forcibly de facto as well as de jure part and parcel of Czechoslovakia. The Czechoslovaks had long foreseen the possibility of war against Germany, and they had prepared accordingly. Czechoslovakia was fairly industrialized, more so than any other country in Eastern Europe, and therefore their armed forces were fairly well equipped. Sudetenland was very precious to Czechoslovakia because of its many factories. It produced a lot of timber, and its mountainous landscape meant there were rushing rivers, and these torrents provided 85% of the hydroelectricity for Czechoslovakia. The Czechoslovaks built lots of barbed wire fences, minefields, machine gun nests, anti-tank ditches, concrete bunkers, these dotted the hillsides. Well, that was where the defensive redoubt was going to be. Anyway, Konrad Henlein was the leader of the Sudeten-German Party. He was actually half Czech as well as half German, but he stridently espoused the cause of a greater Germany. He's history's most illustrious PE teacher. Anyway, so joining Germany seemed to be a reasonable position. Whatever one's outlook, if one was an ethnic German, you could be a socialist, a liberal, a conservative, whatever. Leave aside Nazism and Hitler and so on. If the majority of people in an area wish to join a neighbouring country, should that be allowed? It's difficult to say that it should never be allowed. There's at least a little bit of logic and justice to that claim. And I've got to say in favour of Czechoslovakia that this republic was the only fully democratic state in Eastern Europe at the time. The Slovaks and Czechs had been dominated by ethnic Germans for centuries. German had been the official language of the Austrian Empire, and therefore the Slovaks and Czechs had been at a disadvantage. But by the 1920s, the boot was on the other foot. In order to advance in the civil service or professions, one needed a command of either the Czech or Slovak languages. They're almost identical. So the ethnic Germans were usually at a disadvantage, since few of them spoke Czech or Slovak fluently. Anyway, there were violent clashes in the Sudetenland. Some militant Sudeten Germans and a few Czechoslovak soldiers were killed. One mustn't exaggerate this. The death toll was in the dozens. So tensions were on the rise. Influential British politicians lent their ear to the German side of the story, and some were deeply sympathetic. If the United Kingdom was going to fight against the Third Reich, then the UK had enfeebled itself. There was an economic war, as it was called, between the United Kingdom and Southern Ireland. Neville Chamberlain became Prime Minister of the UK in 1938. This all goes back to the Treaty of 1921, land annuities, Irish farmers who had compulsory purchased the farms that they were working on. The landlords, they had to pay back the money used to purchase these from the landlords. These were called annuities, annual payments. In the 30s, the Irish government refused to pay, blah, blah, blah. And there were trade tariffs between ERA and the United Kingdom. But anyway, 1938, this was all sorted out. The UK agreed, okay, we'll scrap the import taxes, and the south of Ireland did likewise. But also, the United Kingdom handed over its 3 military bases in the south of Ireland, Bearhaven, Spike Island, and Lough Swilly. Bearhaven being one of the largest natural harbours in the world. So the United Kingdom had very much weakened itself. Bearhaven commanded the western approaches to the British Isles. And the Treaty of 1921 had allowed the United Kingdom to seize more ports and aerodromes in time of war-strained relations. So Chamberlain invited Eamon de Valera, the Prime Minister of the south of Ireland, to number 10 Downing Street, and they patched up their disagreements. So accord and harmony was established. But Chamberlain engendered very little goodwill in ERA. Dublin did not renounce its claim to Northern Ireland. So this really signalled a weakness to the Third Reich. Churchill was then a backbench Conservative MP and an inveterate rebel, constantly fulminating against all sorts of things. He'd be so immoderate on the idea of Indian progress towards self-governance. And he said it was a terrible misjudgment to bring about the cession of these vital ports to the south of Ireland, which is probably going to be neutral in a future war, and that the German authorities would take note. These ports were very strategically valuable. It did not appear like the United Kingdom was a country that was seriously contemplating military action. So Adolf Hitler announced his intention to liberate, as he would see it, fellow Germans in September 1938. German propaganda went into overdrive, saying the Sudeten Germans were suffering grievously and thousands of them had been massacred, which was hugely inflating the death toll. The Czechoslovak army was fairly well armed, but they were then outnumbered by the German army 7-1. Since Austria had been annexed by Germany in March that year, the Czechoslovaks would have to defend a much longer frontier. They could be attacked on three sides, from the north, from the west, and from the south. There was not enough time to extend their defensive lines along their southern frontier. That had happened only 6 months earlier, that Austria had joined the Third Reich. Bratislava was the second largest city of Czechoslovakia, and it was right on the border, across the Danube from Germany. Therefore, it could be very easily to attack. It could simply be flattened by artillery on day one of any war. So Czechoslovak military strength is sometimes overstated. There is no doubt the country would have lost, without plenty of outside help. France had to form a military alliance with Czechoslovakia. Therefore, she was legally bound to come to Czechoslovakia's aid if she were attacked by the Third Reich. But France, of course, had no land access to Czechoslovakia, and Czechoslovakia, being a landlocked country, no sea access either. The only way France could aid their Czechoslovak allies was by causing a diversion by attacking Germany's western flank. This was highly improbable in view of France's military strategy being entirely defensive-minded. They built up the Maginot Line, named after France's defense minister. It was a line of fortifications that was built at ruinous expense along France's border with Germany. France thought the next war would be a trench war, and France was going to have the very best trenches. Well, often these were underground defences with machine guns with interlocking fields of fire and so much barbed wire, minefields, all the rest of it. Who else could offer to help the Czechoslovaks? The Soviet Union. The Soviets offered to lend their aid, but given the violent oppression which characterised Soviet governance at the time, the Czechoslovaks had no wish to let the Red Army in, thinking if they let them in, they would never get them out. They do have millions of people who have been starved to death by Stalin in the 30s. Anyway, I'll come on to the Munich Agreement in detail later.